there's the same exact issue happens in the book of Philemon, because again, Paul is sending a letter to Philemon, and he's sending this slave named Onesimus with the letter, and he says he's in prison in chains for the gospel and a prisoner of Christ. Okay, well, in that situation, again, Onesimus would have, come back and said, "Hey, he wasn't in jail. This is a bunch of lies." So it raises serious questions about how the letter even came to be preserved as a book of the Bible, given that the person who received it would have said, "No, it was not true." If the people who it was written to didn't venerate it, then why did they make copies of it, and why did they preserve it? Why didn't they speak out against it? It's just unlikely. So, but wait, there's more. Okay, so Polycarp, remember Polycarp? This guy who historians are able to prove like he would have known the apostles. Okay, very early Christian leader. He defines endurance as how Christ suffered for our sins, and then in his letter to the Philippians, he tells the Philippians that they observe this in others, including Paul and the rest of the apostles. So he lists out some other people too. But those other people wouldn't have been witnesses to the resurrection. But Paul and the apostles were. Okay, so again, it's this issue of this is, we can say that just on the basis of this letter from Polycarp to the Philippians, that, they had, these other guys like Ignatius, he writes about in there, he was martyred. Jesus Christ was crucified. These guys, Paul, for example, here was martyred. Okay, on the basis that Polycarp says this, they observed this in others. He wouldn't lie to them about something they knew about. Y'all know. Okay, so this gets into a whole other question of they must have been people there in that church who, were in Rome at the time, or something like that, because Paul was probably martyred in Rome, or maybe he's talking about Paul's willingness to die. Now we've got Ignatius, who's this guy who knew Polycarp, and he's the leader of the church in Antioch, actually, and he writes to the church in Smyrna in 110 AD, okay? And he writes about, he lays it out. He says, the apostles, having witnessed the resurrection of Jesus, they despised or they cared nothing for death. They were unafraid of death. They cared nothing for it. And they were found to be beyond death. Okay? So, he's laying it out very clearly as, he's just claiming it that this is just a source that claims this, okay? It doesn't have this added level of, stuff like we had with Polycarp's letter, but, or with, Paul's writings there. But, given that he knew Polycarp, who was known to have known the apostles, we've got an issue here. Now we get to this guy, Tertullian. Tertullian is this Christian writer. He writes about a lot of things. And he comes much later. He writes 190 AD. So he's far removed. But the thing is, he provides for us evidence of earlier written sources. Literally, he talks about the martyrdom of Peter and Paul in Rome under Nero, the first emperor to execute Christians. He's a source for all of that. He says, if you don't believe me, I'm summarizing it and putting in Ben's words, you can check the official archives of the empire in the lives of the Caesars. So what he's saying is you don't believe me, check the official court documents. The official records of the empire. So in that situation, he believed it, and he, seemed to think he read those documents. He was in a position to read those documents, so it's okay, those documents said that, but those are earlier documents. Those are official court documents from Rome. They would have known this. So, there's very low probability of them lying in those official documents about something like that. So yeah, it happened. Okay. In addition to that, we've got the ancient Roman historian, non-Christian historian Tacitus, who says it too, that Nero persecuted Christians. And there's other sources we can bring together for like Peter and Paul being in Rome at that time. Ignatius writes to the church in Rome, and he says Ignatius is this guy who he ended up getting martyred for his faith. Okay, and he has to go on this walk to Rome to get martyred. Okay, and it's this long walk, and he writes these letters to these different churches. Okay, and he says that he can't command the church in Rome as Peter and Paul could. And you say, well, that doesn't prove that Peter and Paul were ever in Rome, because Paul writes letters commanding churches all the time. It doesn't prove that he was there. But if you take an overview of the things Ignatius wrote, his idea of who gets to be the boss of a church, there has to be like a duly appointed guy, a bishop or overseer at that church. That's Ignatius's point of view. There has to be like a guy there, or like a set of guys that they have been put in charge, handed down authority by the right way, by the right guys. So they are in Ignatius's context, the only way, in his point of view, the only way that Peter and Paul could have commanded the church in Rome is if they were in Rome, running that church. So what that means is we have sort of a timeline of Paul's life that we can figure out. So historians are in agreement that he wrote 1 Corinthians in 55 AD. They're in agreement that Jesus was crucified 30 to 34 AD. What Paul tells us about his missionary journeys, he doesn't really have much motivation to lie about what town he went to and that kind of thing. And he writes these letters to these churches, and there's things like he says, when I was with you, I said this, so they would have definitely known if he was lying about that, so it's probably true. And we can establish this timeline of Paul's life. There's some weird areas, but if he was ever in Rome, he was probably in Rome during this Neronian persecution. And given that sources say that, but more important, but in addition to the fact that sources just straight up claim that he was executed under Nero, and what Tertullian claims is literally in the records, and he's saying, check me on this, that means the way Tertullian says that, it means that it probably said that in the official records, and the official records would have been an earlier, older document, that's closer to the time and would have had access to the information. That's how that, so yeah. But anyway, Nero, the thing is, when you've got Tacitus saying that Nero persecuted Christians, and he's coming at it from a different point of view, he's a historian who's trying to justify why it was okay that Nero was a bad emperor and got executed, but while his ancestor Augustus is worshipped as a god, they literally worship as a god. Those are both okay. He's trying to, that's kind of his political motivation to kind of give an overview of Rome and what Rome's all about, and how to view Rome. But he says Nero persecuted Christians, and Tacitus doesn't like Christians, but he says that Nero used a hated group, an evil group, as a scapegoat for something bad he did, which was set the city of Rome on fire. Whether or not he set the city of Rome on fire, that's a whole other question. But did he persecute Christians? Well, he says that. Okay, then we've got this thing from Ignatius where Peter and Paul were probably in Rome at the time. Then those are two sort of inconsequential points, but they lead to this conclusion in this roundabout way where it's yeah, the Romans, when they persecuted religious groups, they typically killed ringleaders, like Jesus. So, Peter and Paul probably died, okay, in that way. And then if they persecuted, if this persecution happened in 64, there were probably other persecutions that happened. the situation between the Romans and the Jews was about to get a lot more violent, because a war would eventually break out, and Nero would send one of his generals to Israel because the Jews, not getting along with the Romans, and there's a big rebellion that gets put down in 70 A.D., and the Romans destroy the temple. But since Christians were seen as like an offset of Jews, they didn't like Christians either, and so they didn't like Christians. But anyway, one more point, a couple more points, I guess we can make. Origen is this other Christian guy who writes around 240 A.D. You say, well, that's way removed, that's like 180 years after 64 A.D. when they would have died. Like, what does he know about anything? Well, he tells, he's arguing with this anti-Christian guy named Celsus. And so we don't have Celsus, we have Origen's argument against him, his rebuttal, okay? And so it's called Contra Celsum. Again, he's contradicting Celsus. And he says that the disciples of Jesus disregarded the terror of death, having witnessed the resurrection of Christ. So he literally makes it one of his arguments against Celsus that the disciples of Jesus should be trusted. Celsus is he apparently claimed that Jesus, was a trickster who according to Origen, Celsus says that Jesus went to Egypt and learned magic and then went around Israel tricking people, and that Christians only teach their religion to dumb people when no smart people are in the room, and then as soon as smart people come, they stop talking about it, and as soon as the smart people leave the room, they start back talking about Jesus. It was but since Origen makes this a key arguing point, then why would anti-Christians not pick up on it and respond to it? Because there's further arguments with anti-Christians that come later. So why didn't they argue back and say, oh, Peter and Paul, were never martyred? They recanted and said that since Origen makes a point of this as a cornerstone in his argument that we can trust what Peter and Paul said about Jesus because they were willing to die for it. Since he makes that a key point for him, then what we have is an argument from silence. There is no alternative story to what happened to the apostles other than they were martyred for their faith. Okay? With the exception of maybe John. There's more than one version of what happened to John. Okay? There's a silence. There's no competing story. So the anti-Christians would have picked up on this because the Christians, the Origen's an influential guy, he made this a cornerstone. This is a situation where they should have picked up on this, and their silence is deafening in this case. Now, if Christians hadn't made a big deal about it in their arguments, then, the fact that the anti-Christians may have just not cared. But since the Christians made a big deal about it as a point that proves their religion, then the anti-Christians, because there are anti-Christian writers, should have picked up on it. Okay, so that's an issue. Another issue with the argument from silence is Christian legends about what Peter and Paul's exploits after they left Rome or something. If they continued, there's no legend where they continued on and did other things. It's just they were killed. We have legends that arise later about different versions of how they died, and we've got weird things coming out of Paul's head, after they cut his head off, and stuff like that. Because Tertullian does tell us that Peter was crucified and Paul was beheaded under Nero. But there are later accounts that come later that contradict each other on exactly how the apostles died, and they have different versions, and those are clearly, they're just making up stuff because Obviously, somebody's making up something because they contradict each other. But that has no effect on the reliability of the earlier documents. And more importantly, nobody made up a version where Peter and Paul went on to other parts of the world and spread the gospel. You know, like how Thomas went to India. You know, like they don't have that. If they did not die in 64 AD and they continued on another decade or something, then it's just there should have been more Christian legends about it, because they like to make up legends about these guys. I mean, they make up all kind of exploits about Paul and Peter. They had Paul, you know, like going to towns and convincing everyone to never have sex again. You know, there are stories like that. Like I think it's called The Shepherd of Hermas. You know, there's Paul and the lion, where like a lion's got a thorn in his paw and Paul pulls it out and then they befriends the lion. You know, there's legends that were made up about these guys, like a lot of them, but they never made up one. You know, where like they went on to other places and where it would have been like way after their death. It's all, the death is not contested. It's as though Tertullian's right and it was just well-known information that Peter and Paul were crucified in Rome. And if they were crucified in Rome, then I mean, it stands to reason that other apostles were, you know, martyred too, but their stories have not been as well preserved. You know, again, it didn't happen in Rome like with the other guys, where it would have been in the official records. You know, Polycarp says, you know, that they had a Christ-like endurance, you know, comparing them to how Christ was crucified for our sins. He says that all the apostles, Paul and the rest of the apostles, does that mean that they were just willing to die, or does it mean that they actually died? You can maybe take it both ways, but anyway, I think we can see that a rational person should believe that it's taken as very, very probable, you know, like as probable as you want in history, that, I mean, I don't know, there are certain things you could prove better, but I'm not so sure about that. Like, if someone wanted to say Alexander the Great never existed, like, there's a tremendous amount of evidence that would be hard to explain without his existence and easy to explain with his existence. But we have a similar case here. Like, it's like, well, how would you overturn all of this evidence? Like, how could you possibly, what would you, you know, if you want to think about this, like, how likely is it that the apostles really believed it and signed their statements about Jesus' resurrection with their own blood? Like, what would it take to overturn all this evidence I've just given you? Well, you know, I guess we would need some source that said it didn't happen. That didn't happen. But we don't have that. And even if you had one, you would need more than one. You know. But it's very weird that we don't have that. It's just, the key issue to understand here is this whole, like Polycarp, for example, is not going to lie to the Philippians about something they knew to be true. Okay, like they would have known. You're not going to make that up. And he would have been in a position to know that. He's a bishop of a nearby church, you know, and that kind of thing. And time has passed. You know, I think he's writing around 110 AD with Polycarp to the Philippians. But anyway, hopefully we get the point at this point. And he's known to have learned from the apostles themselves. So he's in a position to know whether or not that's true. So anyway, we're going to stop there. There's nothing more for me to say about this. There's a reason why it's considered historically certain that the apostles really believed what they said. And hopefully we've laid that case out. Thank you so much for your time.